that impact, there were fewer papers sold here, just like there were fewer papers sold in the Metro Detroit area. There were some legislators who refused to speak to or be interviewed by the reporters who crossed the picket line. There were occasional lawn signs around the area against the newspapers, like no scab papers here kind of signs, but it didn't have the kind of effect that it would have had if the Lansing State Journal had been the subject of a strike. Because the two Detroit papers were not the primary news source for most of the public in the Lansing area.
I think you may have also touched on this a little bit, but how did some of your colleagues feel about the strike? The sense I've been getting from other interviews is that there was a lot of division, and I just want to see how that might have affected things in Lansing.
Well, there was a lot of division and bad feeling. Some of us didn't go back. Some went back earlier, some went back after the guild said, well, we're kind of giving up on the strike. And there was a lot of resentment among the reporters who didn't go back against those who went back, particularly those who went back early. And it's not that we didn't understand that people went back because they had financial needs, they needed the health insurance, whatever their reasons for, they didn't believe in the strike. But the people, and I think the people who did stay out on strike viewed themselves as willing to make a greater personal sacrifice for the common good. And I know that that bitterness, particularly in people who worked in Detroit, lingered literally for years afterwards. And there were people who were close friends before who didn't talk to each other for a long time as a result of being on opposite sides of the conflict. That was probably the most difficult thing is that long-time friendships and professional relationships shattered as a result of the strike. And it wasn't just the management and union on opposite sides. I think reporters understood that if you were in management, you had made that commitment, you weren't represented by the union, and you were obligated to go to work. And the strikers may not have liked seeing their editors walking across the picket line or running into the building to avoid being yelled at, but I think there was more, not sympathy for the management, but at least an understanding of why the managers did it, and more resentment against the rank and file workers who crossed the picket line.
I imagine that you must have read the coverage of the strike, and I just wanted to get a feeling of how you felt about how it was being covered.
I don't have much of a sense of it. I didn't look at either of the Detroit papers during the strike. There were occasional stories in Lansing State Journal, but they were wire stories, and wire stories tend to be relatively fair and relatively balanced. I did read the Detroit Sunday Journal stories, which were probably disproportionately favorable to the union position. So I don't, and I didn't watch TV, so I didn't, in terms of the Detroit area stations, so I have no way of knowing how the broadcast media covered the strike and whether that changed over time from the first days when there was a lot of conflict, and then it's dragged out and dragged out and dragged out.
I also want to get a sense of has your opinion on the strike changed as it was going on? I mean, did you feel more strongly in the beginning than towards the end, or I just want to get a sense of that.
Yeah. Well, what changed was the realization as the strike continued that it was a terrible idea to go on strike, because we and management had underestimated how long it would take to resolve, and the difficulty in bridging the gap and reaching some kind of conclusion. Whether the strike vote would have been, or the vote to strike would have been the same had everybody known it was going to go on for a couple of years, I don't know. I suspect that maybe the majority would not have voted to strike, but that's hindsight, and there's no way to tell. As the longer it went on, in a sense, the more removed I became, because I wasn't on the negotiating committee. I wasn't going to all the rallies and the meetings. As a full-time freelancer, I made a comfortable living, and after a year when I joined the faculty full-time, I knew I wasn't going to go back, even if everybody got together lovey-dovey, that at least if I still enjoyed being on the faculty, which I had, then I probably would not return to the newsroom anyhow. So it was more of a feeling less involved, less engaged in it. I kept up with, by participating in the coverage for the Sunday Journal, as long as that kept being printed, but that was the degree of my involvement.
Well, those are the questions that I had sort of written down to ask you, so I was wondering if you had anything else you would like to add or say.
The one other thing I would add is that at no time did I ever think of not going on strike when the union vote came through, and at no time did I consider coming back, even though I was getting calls from former colleagues who had crossed the line saying, well, why don't you come back, we'll treat you well. I grew up in a union family, and although my parents were not active in the unions, my father was a union roofer, and he had been on strike, and I remember the hardship that was. I was small at the time, but I remember the hardship that meant for our family. My mother was a union teacher. She went on strike. That caused hardship for the family. My brother had been a unionized teacher for a while, until he changed careers. My wife had been a unionized daycare teacher, and I had been in the newspaper guild first in Albany with my original newspaper job, and again, not active in the union, but a member of it, and then joined the guild when I was eligible at the Detroit News. So it was never a real alternative to me not to strike or to cross the picket line. And I was fortunate that I had some skills and freelance contacts, so and my wife was working, so that although we had kids to raise, we were able to pay the car, put food on the table and all, until I ended up with a full-time job at the university. And the hardship on some of my colleagues was much more substantial because of the sacrifice they made, and they didn't have, they may have had only one income, they may have had more kids, they may have had medical problems in the family. And they were really the ones who made much more of a personal, painful sacrifice. And for those who stayed out through the length of the strike, despite those kinds of pressures and despite those kinds of hardships, I just had the greatest admiration